This is my sermon for our final homiletics assignment, addressed to some of my family members. Here we go. So today I'm going to ask you something that God asks Israel in Deuteronomy, and that is to remember your slavery. To recall how you were bound to sin before you ever encountered Jesus. And to think of the difference he has made for you, which may not always seem like a lot when we first think about it. But I imagine that this room is full of miraculous stories, and I really wish I could hear them all. We find some of these stories in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, as some of you I'm sure know, is written as a speech that Moses is giving to the people of Israel before they cross the Jordan River into Canaan. For generations, they had been slaves in Egypt and have been crying out to God from their oppression. And God hears their cries and acts mightily, using the servant Moses to deliver them from their condition. Through many miracles, including all of these plagues that devastate Egypt, God leads his people through the Red Sea, and then they start wandering through the desert for 40 years, in which God is intimately available to his people as a pillar of fire and a cloud of smoke. And he leads them up until this point where they're ready to cross the Jordan River and enter the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised them. Taking this land would not be easy, but with God on their side, fighting for them, victory is promised. So, this speech that Moses is making is on the eve of this crossing. It's an evening full of anticipation and promise, excitement and fear, and Moses gathers Israel together. In his speech, he recounts the story of God's deliverance in the Exodus. He identifies this historic idolatry of Israel as the root of their suffering, and faithfulness to this new covenant that God makes with Israel as the basis for blessing. If they adhere to this covenant, they will be blessed. But if they turn back to the idolatry that had kept them enslaved and kept them wandering in the desert, then they would return to the cursed position that they were in before. After opening a narration summarizing this story, Moses moves on to an extensive list of commands, and they're designed to help keep the people of Israel in line with the character of God, and to prevent them from stumbling once more into the arms of other gods, as idolatry was continually a problem amongst them. So they mark the expectation, or Yahweh's expectation, for life in Israel. And then following these commands are a list of blessings and curses. And the blessings are the fruitful outcome of proper adherence to these laws, and the curses are what to be expected if Israel becomes disobedient. The book ends then with a farewell address from Moses, who passes on leadership of his people to Joshua, because Moses actually never enters the land of Canaan. So within this extensive list of commands, this 12-chapter list, come two commands in particular that we're going to be focusing on for today. They're in Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 22, so I'll read them here. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. The second is, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather your grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterward. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. Here, Moses outlines a few protections for the most vulnerable members of an ancient Israelite community. The three groups included the sojourner, or you could say a foreigner, alien, the migrant, the fatherless, or orphan, and the widow. All these three groups of people would not have the protections that come from relational ties. The sojourner would be in a land in which they didn't have any familial connections. They would not own land and would therefore work on other people's land as day laborers. Orphans, likewise, did not have a family nor an inheritance that could offer any protections. And widows in a patriarchal society could not own their own lands and therefore were at the mercy of the community. Together, these three groups work as a shorthand for those who are the most vulnerable, least safe, have the greatest physical needs, and at first glance, the least to offer. Given their lack of power, these people also are the easiest targets for exploitation. The first command states, "You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge." Though it would be easy to take advantage of an orphan who had no way to defend himself, you will, the one with more power, ensure that they are treated equally under the law. They will get the payment for labor that is fair. They will get equal treatment under the law. The section taking a widow's garment in pledge refers to a custom leaving a garment as collateral, given that you have so few possessions to offer in that stead. So potentially before working for a day in the employer's field. So it mirrors a similar command in Exodus about day laborers. Here it switches it to widows to fit in with this sojourner or fatherless widow structure. So in an era where one's cloak could be the best source of warmth for the evening, and therefore a potential shield against discomfort, sickness, or even death, this command says not to hold on to this collateral, though it is still financially or potentially legally a valid option. If someone needs it, let them take it with them. Though in the eyes of the modern day lawyer, we may be able to argue that both parties consented to this economic exchange, and the widow knew the risks and did not perform well enough to earn her cloak back. God is saying, put the dire situation of the individual above the contract. Justice, according to God, gives additional protections to the poor. It tells power to leverage its position for the benefit of the weak, not to maximize its own gains. I just wonder, is this the way we think? Is this what we think of when we hear the word justice? The passage continues. When you reap your harvest in the field and forfeit a sheaf in the field, you should not go back and get it. It will be for the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow, and the Lord will bless the work of your hands. When you beat your olive trees, you shall not go over them again. When you gather your grapes of your vineyard, you shall not strip it afterwards. In these words, an economic safety net is being established for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, for the most vulnerable people in this society. The command says to leave behind the remnants of the harvest for those who have no other way to feed themselves. As you go through harvesting wheat and you leave some sheaves behind, leave them so that the poor might have some bread. Someone will come by who needs them more than you. And as you beat down the olives from your trees, and that's the way they would harvest them, is smacking the tree trunks, and then the olives would fall down. Don't beat them twice, because someone else is going to need them more. Lastly, once you've gathered your grapes, primarily used for wine, don't scrape the vines dry. Leave the remaining grapes to the widow. In these three categories of crop, we have the three basic foods for Israelite life: bread, oil, and wine. God commands them not to maximize every possible ounce of profit, but to leave what is left for those who need it most. Those who have no other way to eat. Those who have no other safety net. This command gives the community directions as to how to protect its most vulnerable. Remember, there's no welfare, there's no unemployment checks, there's no food stamps, no charities. In rural Canaan, the foreigner, orphan, and widow live and die by the charity of the community. God makes the explicit point that the community is only doing enough if they give some of what they have to the poor. They are only doing enough if they make sure the widow can take her life-saving collateral home. They are only being just if they are leveraging their power and safety for the marginalized. Anything less would displease God and risk bringing curses upon Israel. I think that this notion of justice is foreign to our American sensibilities. While we may value charity, and I think we do, justice is mostly about people getting what they deserve. The wealthy can leverage their position in a contract to force workers into lower wages. If both parties voluntarily agree on the contract, it's just. While it is a good thing to donate some of my crop to the poor potentially, I'm well within my rights to do whatever I please with my belongings. All people are to be treated equally. In fact, we may even feel like unequal treatment of the poor in this passage. Some would call it a preferential option, a preferential treatment for the poor, is unjust because they are getting special treatments that others do not receive. Why do they get their collateral back? Why do they get to come and get free things? Why should I leave grapes on the vine that I grew? I'm losing profit. I still have a family to feed. To this point, the scholar Telford Work and his commentary on Deuteronomy have an insightful angle. Yahweh upholds justice for the least and this is a quote from him, Yahweh upholds justice for the least and provides for the destitute, foreigners, and orphans because he shows no favor. The ones Yahweh blesses with prosperity are his means of blessing sufferers, so that all who work in Israel are blessed. I'll read that again. Yahweh upholds justice for the least and provides for the destitute, foreigners, and orphans because he shows no favor. The ones Yahweh blesses with prosperity are his means of blessing sufferers, so that all who work in Israel are blessed. See, the former worldview, our modern American one, only makes sense once we attribute the entirety of our property to ourselves. We have what we have earned, and only what we have earned on our own, as is the case for the poor. Therefore, nobody's getting special treatment. The latter view, the view in Deuteronomy, is that Yahweh has blessed some with land, as he does specifically when he delivers Canaan into the hands of Israel, and blesses others through the prosperous. If he did not include these protections for the poor, he would be showing preferential treatment for the prosperous. He's given them land, and he hasn't given anything beyond to those who need it. What helps cement this point is the last line in both commands. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. Or in the other case, you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this. So built into this expectation, into this command, is the rationale. You were horribly treated for generations. You were exploited by the powerful, who considered their actions just. You cried out to me and I rescued you. I provided for you and you wandered through the desert. And I will give you a land flowing with milk and honey. We're about to cross over the river and claim it. But this is what I, Yahweh, have done for you. What I've done for your fathers, for your grandfathers, and so many before. This is the reason that you have wheat in your fields, olives on your trees, grapes on your vines. I have given you all of this, and through you I will give to the least in your midst. It's so easy to forget what God has done for us, isn't it? And when we do, how easy is it to become hard-hearted, stingy, and arrogant? I think that's why God builds into this command the reminder of the pain of slavery, of poverty, of hunger, of mistreatment. It's by holding this in the collective ritual memory of his people that they will have a chance to build a kingdom different from the one they left. For those of you who have been delivered by God from all sorts of suffering and enslavement, are you participating in building a kingdom better than the one that you left behind? Or have you, like I often have, forgotten what exactly God has freed you from? And that it was God who saved you. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, implores them to remember what Christ has done for them in a very similar sort of way. He says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no man may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." You see the similarity to remember that it is Yahweh who has redeemed you, who freed you from slavery in Israel. "Therefore," Paul continues, "remember that at one time you were Gentiles in the flesh. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ." Just as God calls Israel to remember and continually remember the miserable state in which they lived previously and the mighty work of God to free them, so Paul is calling the church in Ephesus to recall the hope of separation from God they once experienced and the new hope they have through God's work in Christ. The Israel that God is preparing in these passages, the Israel that is supposed to be a kingdom unlike any other kingdom in this world, is the Israel into which these Gentiles are eventually grafted through Jesus' blood. The Israel that's being prepared in Deuteronomy is the Israel that we are brought into through Jesus. How easy is it to forget this alienation from God we at one time experienced? How easy is it to forget that we were once held captive to sin with no way of escaping? How easy is it to forget in our spiritual abundance that we at one time felt no comfort nor fruit from the Spirit? Like the wealthy landowners to whom these commands are addressed, I'm inclined to think that both physically and spiritually we forget our former slavery and the slavery in which others still dwell. Against this state of self-satisfaction, God calls his people to give and to remember. By remembering our state before we met Christ, by remembering the alienation we felt, remembering the lack of joy, the lack of peace, the fruitlessness, the purposelessness, the despair, we foster compassion and empathy for those who are still far from him. We remember the difference that Christ makes, especially to the most hungry. We remember that God has given us so much, especially by comparison. And from this abundance, expects us to give to those who are empty. Because God has blessed us in order that we might bless the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow. It's so easy to consider our spiritual lives something that's continually about ourselves, only for our own enrichment. That the fruit of the Spirit produced in our lives is only to be eaten and nourishing ourselves. I think the thrust of this passage is saying the fruit in your life is to be food, yes, for yourself, but more so for the most hungry. And perhaps in this change of perspective, we will find that we truly become blessed. Perhaps in this change of perspective, we'll find that the kingdom we start building is the kingdom that God intended to be building, and not the one that we've intended to leave behind. So my encouragement is to remember, to think about your state from before you met Christ, to think about the difference he has made. And in that, and in a state of gratitude, and a state of awe of knowing what God has done for us, look to the needs around you and how you may feed the hungriest. Feed the hungriest in your life. And for those of you who are hungry for God, who feel a deep ache for him, Jesus invites you. He says, this is in John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. If you'd like to open yourself up to the satisfaction of this hunger, this longing that you've felt for a long time, believing that maybe there's something else to satiate it, Jesus says that he is the one who can satisfy our deepest hungers. Just as Yahweh is the one who provides for the